Welcome to the France 24 debate. Emmanuel Macron and Angela Merkel, I think it's fair to say, perhaps have the future of Europe in their hands, or maybe more accurately, in their checkbooks. Building on their video conference of May the 18th, the two leaders have been meeting this week at a chateau near Berlin to discuss how a 750 billion euro plan could possibly reboot the EU in the post-pandemic period. Now, Germany's efficiency in limiting the human cost of COVID-19 has been impressive, just at 9,000 deaths, each one, of course, a tragedy, but nonetheless a smaller figure compared to France, Italy, Spain. France statistics more close to 29,000 people losing their lives. So certainly there, Germany showing an efficiency in handling that major crisis. And of course, the major strength of the German economy perhaps puts Angela Merkel in a good position to be riding over this kind of massive investment plan. What actually does France bring to the table then? Monsieur Macron's economic savoir-faire is well reported, well storied, even if perhaps there's no real overwhelming evidence of that so far in his mandate. Well, here to discuss the issues around the Macron-Merkel initiative, the post-pandemic EU, what it will look like, what changes may be made, what will happen to keep people and get people back into business. We have four guests, each with, many opinions, as you will see. I'll introduce them to you in no order of preference because they're all equally preferred and we're glad to have them with us. Anne-Laure Delatte joins us from Paris, an economist at CEPI and CNRS. Anne-Laure, thank you for being with us here on the France 24 debate.
Thank you for the invitation. Hello.
Lorenzo Marsili is Director of European Alternatives, joining us from Palermo in Italy. Lorenzo, thanks for being with us. Daniel Stelter is founder of the discussion group Think Beyond the Obvious, joining us from Switzerland. Thank you, sir.
Evening.
And last but not least, we have Olaf Wientzek, who's from the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, Director of the Geneva Bureau and Interim Director of the Paris Office, and again, joining us from Switzerland. Thank you for being with us, all four of you. Before I let you loose, let's hear what both Emmanuel Macron and Angela Merkel had to say.
Die Erwartungen sind hoch und wir wissen ganz genau, natürlich, wenn Deutschland und Frankreich einig sind, ist nicht Europa sich einig. Aber wenn Deutschland und Frankreich sich uneinig sind, dann ist es mit der Einigkeit Europas nicht besonders gut bestellt. Und insofern können wir vielleicht durch Einigungen in vielen Fragen auch einen Beitrag dazu leisten, dass wir einen positiven Impuls in die richtige Richtung für die europäische Zukunft geben.
How can we make this Franco-German agreement a success for Europe, for a more united and sovereign Europe? First, by doing everything possible to obtain a budgetary agreement in July on a common financial framework, 2021 to 2027, and on the recovery plan. I will make this very simple. We must manage to consolidate what we have decided. A joint loan, at least 500 billion euros in budgetary subsidies, destined toward the regions most affected. We've put it in black and white with the Chancellor. This is our top priority. This is what will enable Europe to rise to the challenges it faces today.
There we heard it from Merkel and Macron. When France and Germany get on, it's great news for Europe. When they don't, of course, it leads to stagnation. Anne-Laure, can I bring you in first to give us some of your kind of analysis and reaction, really, to what the two leaders were talking about at this extremely important meeting. Extremely important. It's like 750 billion euros of investment that we're looking at.
Yeah, first, I think it's important to react to what you just said. Indeed, when France and Germany are together on board, that is super important, very key for European integration. And before May 18, actually, Germany was not on board. I think that a break moment, a very important moment, was, Karlsruhe court ruling at the beginning of May, when they criticized the action of the European Central Bank. And this ruling actually puts the solidity of the euro area in danger, because everything was actually relying on the ECB, on the monetary policy. Then probably Angela Merkel realized that without any budget, any budgetary transfers, and any active and dynamic policy, indeed, the euro was very much in danger, and we would actually live the same scenario as in 2012. So this is very important to have that in mind. Germany is now back on board with France, and I can discuss that later and give more detail. But indeed, this plan is very important and quite new because it implies transfers, budgetary transfers, and not only loans. So yeah, this is key, and I can get back on this later.
Anne-Laure, we're very, very glad to hear anything you have to say on that issue, and don't hesitate to put it forward. Let's move on to Lorenzo Marsili from European Alternatives. Lorenzo, the concept of France and Germany working really together on this one, bringing forward financial possibilities, thinking about the others. Are you convinced by this?
Well, you could say better late than never. We've been through over a decade of European crises through which European leaders, including the leaders of France and Germany, have been actually unable to respond in any way that strikes as ambitious, visionary, imaginary, or even effective. So for the first time after 10 years of economic and political crisis, we see some action. And indeed, we see some action that goes in the direction of ambition. It is, I think, not to be underestimated, as was being said, the size of the rescue fund, of the investment foreseen by it, and it is not to be underestimated that Germany is back at the table. Now, the question is it enough to continue with a European Union where the Franco-German axis occasionally, apparently once in a decade, manages to do just about what it takes not to let the Eurozone collapse? Or should we be looking at a more ambitious process of reform that transforms the dysfunctional intergovernmental system of which the Franco-German partnership is part into a real effective transnational democracy for the European Union? That is to say, and I finish with this, the rescue fund will be an important element of the German presidency. We should not forget the so-called conference on the future of Europe, because investment is important, but a political community is not going to be made only by money. We need institutional and democratic reform to make that effective.
Lorenzo Marsili of European Alternatives, thank you so very much indeed. Back to you very shortly. Moving on to Daniel Stelter from the discussion group Think Beyond the Obvious. Daniel, this aspect of development in Europe going hand in hand, one thing doesn't go without the other. You need the financial investment, you need to sort of work on the other issues too. Is that how you see it moving? Do you think it's possible?
Well, let me start by saying that I'm in favor of the European Union, and being in favor doesn't mean that you should not be in a position to criticize what's going on. And I'm also supporting the initiative of France and Germany of doing something together. The point is, I'm with Lorenzo, it's much too small. 750 billion are not going to fix the problem. The second point is it's not addressing the root causes, because yes, we had Corona. It was a human tragedy and it was an economic problem or crisis for Europe, but mainly a humanitarian tragedy for Italy. On the other hand, we have to accept that the high debt levels of Italy, of Spain, of Portugal, and also of France, we had the issue already before Corona. So in addition, we had already divergent competitiveness. Keep in mind that since we introduced the euro, the economies of the Eurozone have diverged, they're not converged. So we have two problems, divergent competitiveness and very high debt levels. And by just installing transfers from Germany to the other countries, we are not going to address these issues. In addition, we also have a point around fairness. Just keep in mind that if you look at total debt levels, Italians have a low debt level like the Germans have. The French have a very high debt level. When I mean total debt level, I mean private households, private companies, and the government. So in Italy, it's more a problem of too high debt level of the state and very rich private households. Compared to GDP, by the way, the Italians have more private wealth than the Germans. So assuming Germany will be able to sustain the whole European project just by more and more transfers, my point of view is just a hope which cannot be sustained given the fact that Germany faces existential crisis of its most important industries like the automotive industry. We have the upcoming demographic change. So we've got many issues coming here. And therefore, in my view, what we need to do is we have to address the existing debt level. And just last sentence, and my proposal here is to pool existing government debt of all countries, including Austria, including the Netherlands, including Germany, on a European level and have it refinanced by the ECB, by the way, in a perpetual way, so basically getting it off our books. And then we can continue as we did in the past, and we have autonomy. Keep in mind, if you inherit 10 million euros from your grandfather in Germany, you pay more than 2 million euros inheritance tax. If you inherit 10 million euros from your grandfather in Italy, you pay less than 400,000 euros inheritance tax. This example already shows you how difficult it is to embark on transfer union without agreeing first on this global and on a European-wide similar taxation, similar social welfare, etc., etc. We won't be able to do this, and therefore rather deal with the existing debt than hoping that transfers are going to fix the problem. They buy us time, but they are not the solution.
Indeed, getting 27 states to agree on one particular issue always proves extremely difficult, doesn't it? And this aspect of different types of taxation, different approaches is really something that is glaringly obvious. Let's bring in Olaf Wientzek from the Konrad Adenauer Foundation. Olaf, one of our guests earlier talking about how Germany's turned around. I think it was Lorenzo talking about it being better late than never. Why has Germany decided to come on board at this stage? Can you give us more of the context on that?
Well, I would not completely agree with Lorenzo regarding the relatively negative assessment of what Germany and France have been doing in the past 10 years. I would say that they have been addressing the crisis, as has the EU as a whole. It's, of course, a very divisive subject, so it takes time to build compromise. And as we see currently, the Franco-German compromise is a necessary but not a sufficient condition. So I would not be as negative as that. And now, regarding the current crisis, I would see that this is a bit the recognition that an unprecedented challenge requires an unprecedented response. And this is, I think, why it changed. We also see the big danger for the internal market through the crisis or for the consequences of the corona crisis. So I think this has been a very major element. And what you also see, and I think this is quite remarkable, that in principle, I underline in principle, the CDU-CSU parliamentary group has been supporting this plan. But I think we will see, of course, during the European Council in July, that of course the devil may be in the details. I think it's, from a German point of view, it's important that it's an exceptional measure, that there is conditionality, that it's well aimed, that the money doesn't just disappear somewhere in member states' budget. But I think, to summarize, it is indeed the recognition that this is a really unprecedented crisis with unprecedented threats for Europe, for European unity, and for each one of the member states.
An unprecedented crisis indeed. COVID-19 showing that clearly states need to make enormous efforts to work together to bring things together and try to keep things in order. Is it perhaps COVID-19 that's perhaps shown how the EU perhaps doesn't work? How there's this lack of cohesion, this lack of coherent policy, the fact that one country can just have 9,000 dead, others can go above 20,000, 30,000. The UK's left the EU, of course, but obviously as part of Europe, as a continent, we're looking at over 40,000 dead there. Has COVID-19 perhaps exposed the real weaknesses of the EU? Anne-Laure.
Well, let me give you a more economic perspective. If COVID-19 has shown something, it's that for every shock, every exogenous shock that we're hit by, we actually react very differently. So you were talking about COVID cases and COVID death. I will be much more basic, I'm sorry, but this shock, it was a sanitary shock. It could have been a migration shock. It could have been a financial shock. Whatever happens, when there is something, actually look at Germany, Netherlands, north of Europe, they react quite okay. While Italy, Spain, Greece, and some other countries will be actually affected much more strongly from an economic perspective. You could see that with the sovereign rate, so the interest rate at which sovereign borrow. And the main fear, so the main motivation of the plan we're discussing now, comes from, so the main fear at the beginning of the crisis that we would actually live again the same scenario as in 2010 until 2012, when Draghi, the chairman of the ECB, said, whatever it takes. So whatever shock, and I'm insisting on this because unfortunately, I think that there is a high probability that in the next decade, we will have other kinds of shock. And every single time, actually, investors see that Italy, Spain, south of Europe is not as resilient as the northern economies. Why is it so? Yeah, you're probably right. They are highly indebted, while Spain is not as highly indebted as Italy, so everything is not that simple. But yeah, there is a very big distinction between debtor and creditor countries. Okay, we have that in mind, and now what can we do about that? Either let the market decide, and you have investors rushing on safe assets like German assets, Dutch assets, even French assets. Believe it or not, French bonds are considered as safe assets. So we have investors rushing on these bonds, which means that their price go up, while Italian and Spanish bonds, their price go down. And that actually put in danger, put a lot of pressure on the capacity of this sovereign to repay their debt. So it amplifies the problem because you start with very high level of debt, and actually you're kind of punished by the market, and you will have to repay, not only to raise more money to face the shock, but this money could actually, you need to pay a high price for this money, okay? So that was the diagnosis by March 12, and the ECB has been very reactive, offered a very important program of securities purchase, and right after, the European executive tried and designed new plans, and very soon, by May 18, and now we're at the end of June, so this is very, very short compared to what happened in 2010 until 2012. We have to keep this in mind. So very short after, the governments, the European executives, helped by the European Commission, have decided not to let the ECB the only person on board, okay, the only person responsible on board, and they've decided to offer this plan, to design this plan, so that the big burden that could actually affect the highly indebted countries be reduced by transfers and by all this.
Angela, sorry, but you cannot
Did
fix
you call me
Italian.
Angela?
Sorry, sorry. But
Anne-Laure, if you could pause and let our friend Daniel Stelter have a little interjection, please.
Yeah, because first of all, I think it's many issues. The first point is that the market is not efficient. We can see because Italians actually they saved. Italy saved more. The government saved more money than Germany in the past 10 years. So they're not wasting the money. The problem in Italy is growth. The true sinner on European level concerning debt is France. So if the financial markets were efficient, France should pay higher interest rates. Secondly, Italy didn't accept money from the ESM, but they rather made a domestic loan, only for domestic investors with preferred interest. So Italy was voluntarily, the government was willing to pay higher interest rates voluntarily. It could have got money cheaper getting to the ESM or going to the overall financial markets. So what I mean by this is very simple. You cannot fix the problem of too much debt by just introducing transfers, because transfers can't be big enough. We have to have a debt restructuring in a clever way via the ECB. I'm totally with you. The politicians hide it behind the ECB in the past 10 years. We cannot do that in the future. But the problem is still the current plan is only buying time. It's kicking the can down the road. And by the way, Olaf, the Germans assume it's not the start of a transfer union. The Spanish politicians, the French politicians are celebrating because they see it as the start of a transfer union. The point is, even if a transfer union were fair, which it isn't, given the fact that Germans are poorer than Italians and French and Spanish people, it doesn't work. It can't be big enough. So we have to have a solution for past debt. And if we don't do this, we are overburdening the people who are paying as the transfers, notably the Germans, who are willing to do so, but you're overburdening it. And in 10 years' time, we have another crisis, but it will be the final crisis, and there won't be any more solution. The only solution is print money for old debt, monetize old debt, and then, last sentence, I think it's it's a wrong assumption to say the European Union should be better to deal with the crisis. My point is the crisis has shown the benefit of decentralization. Being centralized not necessarily means it's better. Look, why did the German healthcare system perform better than others? Probably also because of decentralized decisions. And it's not only a question around, how big is the government? The government in France is much bigger than the German government relative to GDP. In Italy is the same. It's a question of how these people allocate money. And if we now have, as Lorenzo believes, we have a so-called democratic Europe, which means basically a majority of the South, then we might end up being all more like the non-so-well-performing public systems. And I think that's not a successful path down the road. Again, I'm pro-Europe, but the European Union needs to reform. And these reforms are not just by having more transfers.
Indeed. So if I'm understanding it, if France and Germany sneeze, financially speaking, it's Italy, Spain, the others.
Well, I would say if Germany goes down, and we will, given our problems, given the unfunded liabilities, given our demographics, we will not have the financial power to be the backstop for the whole of Europe. Europe needs to reform, and it's not done by transfers, and it's not done by relying on the ECB. We need debt restructuring. We need a reform of the Eurozone. Probably not everyone should be a member anymore. Parallel currencies for Italy. And then we should move on as friends. This is a much better way than continuing what we do.
Let me bring in Olaf to respond to that one. Olaf, over to you.
Well, I agree on some issues. I disagree on others. I think, first of all, and this is kind of a general comment, it's very important not to go too much into this logic. The South has been doing badly, and the North is so amazing. If we look at the Corona crisis, for example, we see that, for example, Greece has been managing relatively well.
Very good.
So I think that's an important point to make, and we see a number of countries in the so-called north of the geographical north of the European Union which have had much bigger problems. So I think this is one point. Okay. Regarding Parliament, regarding democracy in the EU, I think this is something where I take a kind of a middle position between Lorenzo and you, is in the sense that I think the subsidiarity principle is a very important one. So let's say putting everything on the upper level, on the European level, will not necessarily heal things. However, what I think is important if we install such a fund is that the European Parliament gets an oversight. I mean, parliamentary control on that one, also on what the money is spent, I think would be very important. So I think there is a mix here of points compared to what you mentioned earlier. Regarding expectations, and I think you made a very important point there, I agree that it is very important to communicate well regarding this fund, because, as you said, the Spanish probably understand something completely different than the Germans. And I think that expectation management will be a very important one. And this is in general true. I think the EU will help a lot, can help a lot, but it cannot solve all the problems itself. Many things or many reform agendas have to be done on the national level. So I think fund which strengthens conditionality and which encourages reform and helps to make a new start of the economy, a more modern economy, I think that would be very important and a very important function of the fund, because as you rightly imply, there is a reform necessity and some things have to be reformed very fundamentally, and you need more incentives to do that.
Thank you very much indeed. Let's bring in Lorenzo to get an Italian perspective on this one. In some way, do you feel the Italians, Spanish, the Greeks are being maybe unfairly targeted in this debate?
No, well, look, firstly, let me say that Germany, to some extent, France, certainly countries of the north, including the United Kingdom, have had several weeks ahead notice about COVID-19, whereas Italy has been the canary in the mine, as it were. It is the country that has suddenly discovered an outbreak of gigantic proportions. It's been the first democracy to test the meaning of a pandemic that demands a lockdown. It's been the first democracy to go into lockdown and to imagine the legal tools to mobilize a democracy of 60 million people in ways that have been truly unprecedented and borderline unconstitutional in a country that is not China. So in that sense, the fact that notwithstanding being the first canary in the mine, Italy has managed to contain the virus moderately effectively, certainly very effectively when compared to the United Kingdom or the United States, as effectively as France or Spain, perhaps less effectively than countries with a much better and better funded health service as Germany or Sweden. I think actually that's quite a meritable achievement that ought to be recognized to the Italian government, despite the fact that I have no particular sympathy for it. That said, I think COVID-19 has also shown that Europeans are not equal, that we don't have the fundamentals of a common political union where, for instance, a Greek, a Spaniard, a German, or a Swede should be looking with the same confidence or the same fear at the prospect of hospitalization. We have Europeans who know that if they end up in hospital, they're guaranteed an emergency bed, and Europeans who know that if they end up in hospital, they probably will be left outside of intensive care because there are not enough intensive care beds in some European countries, also due to the austerity measures of the last decade. We have a European Union where the basic fundamental of citizenship rights are highly fragmented, and COVID-19 has shown that to be the case. And this demonstration of the unequal access to fundamental rights within the European Union is one of the reasons why COVID-19 has left quite a powerful wave of renationalization. In Italy now, the opinion polls about exiting the EU give an almost 50-50 split. Italy used to be the most pro-European country of Europe. Something has happened, has been happening over the last decade, has accelerated during the COVID-19 crisis, and it should not be underestimated. The last point I want to make is that I also don't like transfers, and I fully agree with Daniel when he says that we need to monetize debt. All the world, all the developed world is engaged in a great exercise of monetizing debt without making it look like you're just making it disappear. There are ways of doing that. Europe should do it. Perpetual bonds, ECB, whatever, any options, just do it. Fine. I think you need to convince Germany.
Germany should participate, by the way. It should not be just for, it should be for all countries and not just for the very high debt levels.
Absolutely. But the last point I want to make is you need democracy to avoid a transfer union in the long term. Because avoiding a transfer union means creating own resources for the European Union. Own resources means enabling the EU to tackle wealth where the nation state is unable to reach. Whether there is a carbon tax, whether there is a digital tax on multinationals, whether there is closing the loopholes of tax havens within the European Union that drain resources from most countries and tend to concentrate them in Luxembourg, Netherlands, Ireland, and to some extent Cyprus. To do that, to bring in new resources that can be invested for pan-European investment without transferring it between countries, you need this exercise of institution building, of a new capacity to raise taxation on the part of the European Union. We know that there is no taxation without representation. So if you want European taxes that enable you to get rid of transfers, you need elements of European democracy. And I think that's the big gamble that we have ahead of us in the next years.
And Lorenzo, just one sentence on this. I agree with you, but the most important point then is that one vote in each country should have the same weight. And currently, as you know, the European Parliament votes, elections take part on a national list and not on a European list. And secondly, the votes of someone in Malta has much more weight than from someone from Italy, France, or Germany.
Well, I would like to jump in there. I would like to jump in there because I think this is one of the misconceptions we have about Europe. I mean, look, for example, at the US. Depending on the chamber, the votes weigh very differently. Look, for example, at least to a certain extent, even at Switzerland. So you have democracies where you have a different leverage of a vote. I think this is not an argument which is a very strong one in my opinion.
But they've got two parliaments. They've got the representative of the cantons or the states, and they've got the direct election of the central government. And here we have the issue that the parliament, the European Parliament, that if a vote for Malta is 12 times the weight of a vote from Germany, and then you do taxation allocation based on this, I think we have an issue.
I think we have an issue in general in the sense that one should not proceed, let's say, beyond or above the heads of the European citizens. I think this is an approach which will take time, or you need to take the citizens along. And some steps with two quick steps in debt, for example, may be too quick for the populations and for the acceptance of the European project. I think a balance needs to be kept there. And for Switzerland and the US, I think even if you look at the lower chamber, you see that it's not exactly the same. Each vote is not exactly the same. So
I'll ask you more on that issue of taking people along with you and getting the Europeans to all see the benefits of what could come from this massive 750 billion scheme. Before that, though, let's hear a little bit more about what Emmanuel Macron had to say.
How can we accept in the future that the vast majority of basic medicines or vaccines, whether against COVID-19 or other diseases, be produced outside Europe? 2020 began with a debate on 5G, then on medicine. That is, how can we produce the vaccine in our countries, for our people, once it is found? Ultimately, it's the same debate. It's not about retreating, closing in on ourselves, but being able to protect and strengthen our values, our interests, our essential goods, our strategic enterprises on a European scale.
Indeed, Emmanuel Macron's already announced the launch of a vaccine research and production centre in France on that line of producing enough vaccine to serve the country. And again, that seems as though it's going against the European ideal, but maybe it's smart business. I'll let our panelists decide. I'm wondering whether, and I'll put this question to all of you, whether people are going to be convinced by what they hear about this 750 billion plan. Anne-Laure, can I start with you?
Maybe a reaction to what Lorenzo told us about the Italian people.
Go ahead.
50-50 against Europe. This is quite frightening because this is actually the first time that European executive move so fast and so far. But this is probably because it's not very well understood, and also because Europe has been unable to protect their citizens, to provide the public goods, the common goods that would actually protect them against the effect of globalization and competition. So, well, now just get back very quickly on the monetization of debt, restructuring and transfers. Just to clarify,
Go ahead.
First, restructuring debt, why not? This is, Hamilton did that when they created the dollar at the beginning of the history of the US dollar. So this is actually a way to actually cancel out the debt and try and start from scratch. So why not? Now, do we need ECB to monetize the debt? I see a big danger to this. The problem is that the ECB cannot be, or the central banks in general cannot be the only person in charge. Why? Because we have budget, we have tax that we can use. And by not using taxes, we actually avoid a democratic debate about how to redistribute the cost of a crisis. So we could have a very healthy deliberation inside Europe to know whether we want to tax multinationals that have kept on evading and optimizing taxes over the last 40 years, whether we want to tax high revenue and high wealth people, very wealthy people. I mean, this is a very important debate that we need to implement, to organize in Europe. And this is where I totally agree with Lorenzo. So far, we have an economic Europe. We're very able to put together a very ambitious plan, and I call it an ambitious plan compared to what we had before, but it's intergovernmental. The decision process is based on intergovernmental negotiations, meaning that we all defend our own interests. So I fully agree with Lorenzo.
But isn't it an issue if you talk about higher taxes? So Germany has a tradition of wealth taxes. You know, we paid for it after the hyperinflation. We paid for it after the Second World War. On the other hand, as I laid out, if you take wealth in relation to GDP, Italians, French, and Spanish have much more wealth. Private households have much more wealth relative to GDP. So the absolute wealth level of Germany is significantly lower because of high taxation, because of wars, and many reasons for it, also because of the lower share of real estate. And if you now come up with a program of asking for wealth taxes, for example, or higher taxation in Germany, to fund in a transfer for money to supporting Italians, I will tell you this is basically the certain way of bringing up the negative spirits in Germany against the European Union, because people would see this as being unfairly and correctly so. So I'm with you on taxation, but for example, Italy, as I said before, the Italian government could easily resolve its problems if it followed the recommendations from France Stratégie. You know, France Stratégie has proposed to make the government a partial owner of all real estate in France. They could do the same in Italy, and overnight all their problems are solved. So I'm with you, but then it has to be done by country and not to be used for transfers.
No, but just to clarify my position, I'm not advocating a tax, a wealth tax in Germany to pay for the transfers in Italy.
I'm happy to hear.
What I'm advocating, and what I think Lorenzo has also in mind, is own resources, like European resources, and a common tax on multinational profits, and a common wealth tax at the European level. So no, obviously I'm not advocating Germany to pay for Italy through a domestic tax.
People will be convinced, though, I think, by this, if they start to feel the benefit and see the benefit. How do you think that will happen? How long will that take? What kind of processes will have to be gone through in order for people on the streets of places in Paris, London, London not so much, obviously, because they've gone. So Paris, Berlin, Rome, let's go through the whole of the EU 27. How long will it take for those countries to start to feel the benefit?
Can I say just a warning to avoid replicating this discussion of Italians being richer than Germans, which, by the way, is just ownership of real estate that cannot be sold. Because if we get into these reciprocal recriminations, we will never get out of it. Then you get Italians telling you that we bailed you out twice because Germany is the only country.
That's why I propose, Lorenzo, that's why I propose tax discussion for everybody. That's why I propose tax discussion for everybody. Huh?
Italians saying that in 2014, we paid for the Greek rescue, which served to bail out German and French banks, and Italians and Spaniards have paid for the bailing out of German and French banks. So we never get out of it. So I think also we, as people who speak in public, should avoid replicating these cliches, firstly because they're false, secondly because they're highly counterproductive. Telegraphically on the question, I think we have a gigantic opportunity with the Recovery Fund investment. It needs to be well thought out. It needs to get where it's most needed. We can have a long conversation about this. We don't have the time. I just want to signal that the climate crisis hasn't gone away. We finally have some resources that might be invested for a program of ecological transformation, so that not only we put an economy back to work, but perhaps we also save a planet from climate catastrophe. And I would really like if we focus a little bit more on the systemic impact of public investment when it comes to the climate crisis.
Indeed, you made the point that people perhaps see and hear what goes on. People who read more and watch more in terms of news and documentaries will see how banks were bailed out that shouldn't have bailed out by that money that was meant to get countries out of crisis. And people who feel cynical perhaps about another European plan, massive as it is, with such great potential. But what are those things you're talking about, Lorenzo, the things that maybe you think are perhaps more impactful? Jobs. We need to give people jobs. There are entire parts of Europe where people
don't have any prospect of accessing a job. In the United States, during the Great Depression, there was a public works system that actually performed a gigantic process of ecological transformation. It's what Steinbeck recounts. It's what Bernie Sanders calls the job guarantee. That's also been picked up by recent economic debate. We need to empower public states to employ people for ecologically relevant work. This is not going to be done just by leaving funds to private corporations in the hope that they kickstart an economic growth that is not going to come without a public direct investment into job creation.
Public direct investment into job creation. Anne-Laure, Olaf, Daniel. Daniel, you're shaking your head. Olaf, I'm not sure what your kind of approach is on this. Olaf, I'll go to you first.
Well, I would like to enlarge the debate a tiny little bit, because we are concentrating a lot on the recovery fund, which is very important. I completely agree, and it's necessary that the effects will be visible and that will be well communicated, and not that each capital basically claims any effects just for itself. However, I think the support for the European project, the support for European integration will also depend not only on this fund, but also whether the EU is capable to move ahead on a common European health policy, meaning better coordination on that matter, whether it can bring in its weight on the global level to combat the crisis. The crisis is far from over. We're only talking about economics here, but the pandemic is everything but over. And this is, I think, a very important point. So also whether the EU is able to support a global COVID response, I think it will be also important in the eyes of the citizens.
Would that have prevented the situation that many countries found themselves in now, Olaf, do you think?
Well, I think it's always easy to speak, to be wise after a crisis or after things have happened. But I think if we had stronger health policy coordination, if we had stronger, let's say, a common European global health approach, I think this would have helped.
Olaf Wientzek from the Konrad Adenauer Foundation. Thank you very much indeed. Thanks to all our guests. Daniel Stelter from Think Beyond the Obvious, Lorenzo Marsili of European Alternatives, and Anne-Laure Delatte, the economist at CEPI and CNRS. Thank you all for joining us in this France 24 debate. Stay with us.